When I opened my eyes, the ceiling above me felt unbearably white, sterile, and endless, as though it had swallowed every trace of color from the world. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, and the silence pressed on my chest more heavily than the pain from the stitches across my abdomen. I turned my head to the left, expecting to see a familiar face in the chair by the window, Daniel's reassuring profile, or perhaps Claire's restless fidgeting, or Luke's quiet eyes watching over me. But the chair was empty, untouched, as though no one had ever thought to sit there. I waited for the door to open, for footsteps, for the sound of a family who cared. The only sound was the distant beep of a machine, reminding me I was still alive, though I wondered if anyone out there remembered that fact. I tried to convince myself that maybe they were late, caught in traffic, or confused about visiting hours. But my phone on the nightstand betrayed the truth. A single notification glowed on the screen, showing Amelia's name in bold letters, and a picture of her laughing with a champagne glass raised high. My sister's promotion had finally been announced, and the entire family, my husband, my children, even distant cousins, was there celebrating with her. While I lay in the sterile room with fresh scars, they toasted to Amelia's brilliance, smiling for photographs that would circulate through social media by morning. The betrayal cut deeper than the scalpel that had opened my body, because wounds in flesh can heal, but the wound of being forgotten by those you love grows wider in the silence. I wanted to cry, but tears felt useless, like raindrops in a desert where no seed would ever sprout. What hurt most was not only their absence, but the ease with which they had chosen it. Daniel had promised he would never leave me alone, had sworn on our wedding day that I would always come first in his heart. Yet tonight, he lifted his glass to Amelia's triumph instead of holding my hand. Claire, at 19, had already begun drifting toward her aunt's world of polished ambition and constant applause, finding in Amelia the role model I had apparently failed to be. And Luke, sweet Luke, only 15 and still unsure of who he was becoming, had he gone because he wanted to, or because it was easier than staying with the mother nobody else had chosen? The question gnawed at me like a rat in the dark. The room itself seemed to mock me, with its sterile perfection and fluorescent light humming overhead. The tray beside my bed still held the untouched meal they had delivered hours earlier. Lukewarm soup, stale bread, and fruit I could not bring myself to eat. Hospitals are supposed to be places where one feels cared for, where healing begins with comfort. But all I felt was abandonment that seemed to seep into the very walls. The nurses who peeked in offered polite smiles, professional kindness, but none of them could replace the weight of a familiar hand squeezing mine, the warmth of a whispered word from someone who knew my name before I ever entered this cold place. I felt like a ghost haunting my own body, unseen, unimportant, a mere afterthought. I tried to close my eyes and rest, but memories of childhood returned uninvited, dragging me backward to nights when Amelia was the star of every gathering. I could see our mother's eyes glimmer with pride whenever Amelia walked into a room, while mine were met with distracted nods or gentle reminders to step aside so my sister could shine. I had told myself for years that adulthood would be different, that Daniel's love, my children's laughter, would finally make me feel seen. But here I was again, 31 years old, and just as invisible as the little girl hiding in the corner of the family living room while Amelia cut her birthday cake. The old wound had never healed. It had simply learned to hide beneath daily routines until tonight ripped it open again. The beep of the monitor pulsed on, steady and unfeeling, as though mocking the fragility of my heart. I thought about calling Daniel, but what would I say? Why didn't you come? He would answer with some gentle excuse, a lie polished to sound like love, and I didn't have the strength to hear it. I thought about texting Claire or Luke, but the image of them laughing beside Amelia made my fingers heavy with shame. I was alone not because of circumstance, but because of choice. Theirs. That realization settled over me like frost, numbing me slowly, making me wonder how long I had been living in the illusion of a family that would always choose me. The room was empty, but perhaps it had always been. The night stretched endlessly, and I found myself sinking into memories I had long tried to bury beneath layers of daily life. The hospital bed creaked softly as I shifted, and with each movement, I felt the sharp pull of my stitches, as though my own body was punishing me for remembering. Amelia's face kept appearing in my mind, not as the polished woman of today, but as the little girl with perfect curls, already adored before she even understood what the word meant. I could still hear our mother's voice calling her my star while brushing her hair, a tone I never once heard directed at me. I was the quiet one, the listener, the invisible shadow trailing behind the golden daughter who could do no wrong. Even at 31, that shadow had never let go of me. There was one birthday I could never forget. I was 8, and Amelia was 10, and Mother had organized a grand celebration for her in the garden. Balloons, cake, relatives I barely knew. Everyone came. For my birthday 2 months later, There was nothing but a small slice of store-bought cake and a candle I had to light myself because father was late and mother was too tired. At the time, I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't the kind of child who needed attention. But lying here tonight, abandoned once again while my family raised their glasses for Amelia, I realized I had been training my heart since childhood to survive without being chosen. Survival, yes, but never joy. School only deepened the cracks. Amelia excelled at everything: debate competitions, dance recitals. Even the way she walked seemed to draw admiration. Teachers praised her handwriting as elegant and her answers as brilliant, while mine were good enough. I grew accustomed to clapping from the back row, proud yet secretly aching. Once I won a poetry contest, my first and only victory, and I ran home clutching the certificate. Amelia congratulated me with a smile so sweet it almost masked the faint flicker of annoyance in her eyes. Later that evening, during dinner, Mother spoke for 20 minutes about Amelia's new ballet performance and never even asked about my poem. The certificate remained folded in my drawer until the ink faded. Tonight, that forgotten piece of paper felt like my whole life, present but unread. I had thought Daniel was different. When we first met, he looked at me in a way no one else ever had, as though I was the only person in the room. His attention was intoxicating, a drug I had never known I craved. But even then, Amelia hovered at the edges. I introduced them once at a family barbecue, and though Daniel remained loyal in his words and actions, I noticed how his gaze lingered a fraction too long when she laughed. I told myself I was being paranoid, insecure because of my past. Yet now, in this hospital bed, the memory of his admiration for her beauty pressed on me like a bruise I had ignored for years. Was I ever truly chosen? Or was I simply the safer option in a game Amelia had no interest in playing at that time? What disturbed me most was how naturally people abandoned me, as if it required no effort at all. Tonight wasn't the first time. There were countless moments. The time Claire chose to confide in Amelia about her first boyfriend instead of me. The time Luke asked Amelia to attend his school play when I couldn't make it, as though she was his second mother. Even my friends, those I once believed would stand by me, had slowly drifted toward her orbit, dazzled by her charisma, leaving me in the dim glow of ordinary. The truth was unbearable. Amelia didn't just overshadow me. She consumed everyone around me, and I had allowed it, hoping that one day, someone would resist her pull and stay. The hospital ceiling blurred as tears finally escaped, rolling into my hair. I realized I wasn't just mourning tonight's betrayal. I was mourning a lifetime of them. This was not about one party, one absence, one promotion. It was about years of silence, years of being second, years of being invisible. And yet, I had chosen to accept it, convincing myself that love required endurance, that family meant sacrifice, that my turn to be celebrated would come eventually. But lying here, I understood the cruel truth. My turn was never coming. I had been written into this family's story as a footnote, never a headline. And what terrified me most was the thought that perhaps Daniel and the children had gone to Amelia's party, not out of duty, but out of preference. I still remember the first time I saw Daniel. It was a rainy afternoon in the city library, the kind of place where I usually found refuge from the chaos of home. My arms were full of borrowed books, and one slipped, scattering papers across the polished floor. He knelt down immediately to help, his hands brushing mine as he gathered the sheets, his smile warm and unhurried. "You look like someone who reads the world instead of just living in it," he said, a line so strange it made me laugh out loud. That was Daniel, charming without effort, as though words bent themselves into poetry when he spoke. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, not as Amelia's sister, not as someone's daughter, but simply as Evelyn. We began meeting often, at first by coincidence, then with intention. He had a way of asking questions that felt like doors opening, drawing out my thoughts in a way no one else had ever cared to. For once, I wasn't the listener, the background presence. I was the center of a conversation that mattered. Daniel listened when I spoke about my love for words, my quiet ambitions, the pieces of myself I never dared to share because they seemed too small compared to Amelia's grandeur. In those moments, I believed he chose me because of who I was, because my simplicity gave him something her brilliance could not. And when he told me he wanted a life with me, I clung to those words as though they were a lifeline thrown into waters I had been drowning in since childhood. Yet shadows crept in earlier than I liked to admit. At a family gathering shortly after we began dating, I introduced him to Amelia. She swept into the room as she always did, confident, radiant, magnetic. Daniel's polite smile froze for a moment, his eyes flickering toward her before he quickly turned back to me. I tried to ignore the sting of that glance, telling myself it was only natural to be caught off guard by her beauty. But the memory lingered, like a thorn pressing beneath the skin. He never said anything, never gave me reason to doubt his loyalty. But deep inside I wondered, Did he see me as a choice made out of love, or as the consolation prize when Amelia's light proved unreachable? Over time, I buried those fears beneath the comfort of routine. We built a life together, and in many ways, it was good. He was attentive, affectionate, and present during the small rituals of our marriage: Saturday breakfasts, late-night walks, the quiet laughter we shared in our kitchen. Yet sometimes, in crowded rooms or during family dinners, I would catch a flicker in his expression when Amelia spoke. It wasn't desire exactly. It was something subtler, an unspoken acknowledgement of her hold over everyone in the room. I told myself he loved me, and he did show love, but I couldn't silence the question of whether part of his heart was forever distracted by the star my sister had always been. The birth of Claire, and then Luke, seemed to silence those doubts for a while. Daniel was tender with our children, devoted in a way that made me fall in love with him again and again. When Claire was born, I watched him cradle her with awe, whispering promises into her tiny ears. For a time, I allowed myself to believe that love had won, that I was not destined to remain in Amelia's shadow forever. And yet, Amelia remained woven into the fabric of our lives, attending milestones, speaking with ease to Daniel, winning over the children with gifts and stories. I tried to be grateful for her involvement, but gratitude curdled into insecurity whenever I saw Daniel watching her laugh, his eyes softening in a way that made my stomach twist. Now, lying in this hospital bed, the memories I once brushed aside returned with merciless clarity. The truth I had always avoided pressed down on me. Maybe Daniel's smile, the one that had once made me feel chosen, was never meant solely for me. Perhaps it was always half divided, stretched between his love for me and an unspoken admiration for Amelia. The thought lodged itself in my chest like a shard of glass, impossible to dislodge. Tonight, as he raised a glass to celebrate my sister's success, instead of holding my hand in this room, I realized that the smile that had once saved me might, in the end, be the very smile that destroys me. Growing up with Amelia was like living under a constant eclipse. Wherever I walked, her shadow stretched across my path, reminding me that the sun did not belong to me. From our earliest years, people compared us with casual cruelty. Her golden hair, my plain brown, her fearless confidence, my hesitations, her dazzling smile, my quiet one. Relatives would pat her head and call her brilliant, while turning to me with a kind but dismissive sweet. Those words were meant as compliments, I suppose, but to me they felt like bars of a cage, defining who I was allowed to be. I became the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who never asked for more. Amelia, meanwhile, soared higher with every expectation placed on her, expectations that turned into applause. School amplified the divide between us. Teachers adored her, classmates followed her, and every achievement she claimed was magnified as though she had invented success itself. I remember the day she won first place in the regional science fair. The principal held her trophy up in the auditorium while the crowd cheered her name. I stood at the edge of the stage with my own small certificate for participation, clutched in my hand, invisible in the roar of admiration for her. I wanted to be proud. I told myself I was proud, but inside I felt a heaviness that never lifted. Even then, I knew my life would always be measured by her victories and my quiet endurance. Our mother fed this imbalance without malice, yet with devastating effect. She believed she was encouraging Amelia, but in truth, she was worshipping her. When Amelia spoke, Mother listened with shining eyes. When I spoke, she corrected or redirected the conversation toward something more important. Once, I tried to show her a short story I had written for class. She glanced at the first line, smiled distractedly, and then began discussing Amelia's piano recital. I learned to fold my stories away, to hide my thoughts in notebooks that no one would ever read. Mother called it balance, but it was neglect disguised as fairness. Amelia became the star, and I learned to exist in the dim spaces stars cast on others. By the time we were teenagers, the rivalry wasn't even spoken aloud. It was simply understood. Amelia would lead, I would follow. She would succeed, I would support. At family dinners, her jokes filled the room with laughter, while my words fell flat. Friends came to me for advice, but went to her for excitement. Boys noticed her first, and when they glanced at me, it was usually to ask if she was available. I told myself I didn't care, that I valued depth over attention, but a part of me ached every time I saw someone's eyes shift past me toward her. Living beside Amelia was not merely difficult, it was erasure, a slow disappearing act that nobody noticed, because it was so complete. When Daniel entered my life, I thought the pattern would finally break. I believed his choice of me meant I had finally won something Amelia could not claim. But Amelia had a way of inserting herself without trying, and Daniel, like everyone else, was not immune to her presence. At first, I convinced myself that their easy rapport was harmless, that I was being paranoid. Yet deep inside, I felt the old sting return, the certainty that I was once again competing in a game where the rules had already been written against me. Amelia never openly challenged me, never tried to take what was mine, but her very existence seemed to draw all love and loyalty toward her, leaving me clutching whatever fragments remained. Now, lying alone in this hospital room, I realized the rivalry had never ended. It had only evolved. Amelia no longer needed to win trophies or applause. Her life itself had become the victory, a constant stream of admiration and success. And I, as always, was the supporting character, the forgotten one. What made it unbearable was not that she took anything from me deliberately, but that others gave themselves to her so willingly. Tonight, even Daniel and the children, the people I thought belonged unquestionably to my heart, chose her instead of me. That truth pressed down harder than the weight of the sheets over my body, a suffocating reminder that I had never escaped her shadow. The following morning, the door creaked open with a gentleness that startled me, as though someone finally understood the fragility of my silence. Dr. Harris stepped in, tall and slightly stooped, his gray hair combed neatly, though his tie was crooked in a way that made him seem more human than clinical. He checked the monitor, scribbled something on his clipboard, and then, unlike anyone else, he actually looked at me, not just my charts or my wounds. "How are you feeling, Evelyn?" he asked softly, and though the words were ordinary, the sincerity behind them nearly undid me. For the first time since my admission, I felt the weight of another's concerns settle on my chest like a blanket. I swallowed hard, unable to admit that I was less wounded in body than in spirit. I answered with the automatic phrases patients are expected to say, "I'm managing, a little sore but better," and he nodded, though his eyes told me he wasn't fooled. He lingered by the window, pulling the blinds slightly to let the morning light spill into the sterile room. "You seem lonely," he observed, not as an accusation, but as a simple truth. My throat tightened, my instinct to deny it battling with the relief of finally being seen. I whispered, "They didn't come," and immediately felt childish, as though I were a little girl tattling about being left out. But Dr. Harris only nodded, as though he understood a pain too old to be spoken aloud. He said nothing for a moment, and that silence was kinder than any words of pity could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made me listen. "Sometimes, the absence of others tells us less about our worth and more about theirs," he said, adjusting his glasses as though reluctant to meet my eyes. I let the sentence sink in, its simplicity cutting deeper than the sharpest blade. For years I had internalized every absence, every overlooked moment, as proof that I wasn't enough. To hear someone suggest otherwise, someone who didn't know me, didn't share my blood, didn't carry the history of favoritism, was both unsettling and liberating. I wanted to argue, to insist that perhaps I was simply unlovable, but the words caught in my throat. What if he was right? What if their absence was not my failure but theirs? I studied him as he moved around the room, his gestures unhurried, his presence steady. He was not young, not handsome in the way Daniel had been when we first met, but there was something in his demeanor that stirred trust in me. Perhaps it was the way he allowed silence to stretch without discomfort, or the way his questions seemed to reach beneath the surface. For years I had craved this kind of attention, the kind that sought understanding rather than performance. Dr. Harris didn't look at me as if I were overshadowed by someone else. He saw only me, pale and tired, but present. And in his gaze, I glimpsed a reflection of myself I had almost forgotten, a woman worthy of being asked how she truly felt. As he left, he paused at the door, resting his hand on the frame. "Healing is not only for the body," he said quietly. "It's for the heart too, Evelyn. Don't let yours be neglected." The words lingered in the room long after he disappeared into the corridor. I stared at the closed door, wondering why those few sentences from a near stranger meant more to me than anything my family had said in years. Perhaps because, unlike them, he had no reason to flatter or dismiss me. His honesty carried no agenda. For the first time in a long while, I felt the possibility that my loneliness was not inevitable, not my fault, not the destiny Amelia's shadow had written for me. Yet even with that fragile hope, doubt gnawed at me. Would Daniel ever look at me this way again, without distraction? Would Claire or Luke ever choose me over their shining aunt? Or had I already lost them to Amelia's orbit forever? Dr. Harris's words opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, because if he was right, then the family I loved had chosen their absence freely, and love offered under those terms might never be returned. The thought made my chest ache, with a pain the morphine could not dull. Alone again, I lay back, clutching his words like a thread of light in a room that had grown too dark. Claire has always been a mirror I struggled to face. At 19, she carried herself with the same confidence Amelia once radiated at that age, her laughter filling rooms the way mine never could. She had Daniel's charm, Amelia's brilliance, and little of me. I used to tell myself it was a gift, that she had inherited the best parts of everyone around her, but secretly, I wondered what was left of me in her at all. She walked with certainty, spoke with authority, and made decisions as though the world had been built for her to command. I loved her fiercely, but often I felt like I was watching her from behind a glass wall, unable to reach her. When Claire was younger, she used to cling to me with a devotion that felt like sunlight breaking through my clouds. She would crawl into my lap with her storybooks, begging me to read the same tales over and over until she fell asleep against my chest. In those moments, I believed I had finally broken free from Amelia's shadow, that motherhood had carved out a space where I could shine. But as she grew, her gaze shifted. Slowly, her admiration turned elsewhere, first toward her friends, then toward Amelia, who dazzled her with stories of achievements and a life unburdened by compromise. By the time Claire was 15, I realized she had stopped asking me for advice and had started calling Amelia instead. I tried to bridge the gap, to stay close. I offered help with her studies, listened when she fought with friends, cooked her favorite meals to remind her she was cherished. But her answers grew shorter, her eyes drifting toward her phone, her tone carrying that sharp impatience of adolescence. I told myself it was normal, that teenagers pull away from their mothers, that she would return in time. Yet when she celebrated her 18th birthday, it was Amelia who gave the speech that made Claire cry, Amelia whose gift was remembered, Amelia whose presence seemed to matter most. I stood in the crowd, clapping, smiling, hiding the shattering inside me. Perhaps I should not have been surprised that she didn't come to the hospital. After all, I had already begun to fade from the center of her world. Still, the cruelty of it burned. I had carried her inside me, endured hours of labor, sacrificed sleep and youth for her safety. And now, while I lay cut open on this bed, she chose champagne and laughter with my sister instead. Did she think I wouldn't notice? Did she assume my love made me invincible, that I could survive abandonment without breaking? Her silence was not the silence of ignorance, it was the silence of preference. That truth left me more hollow than the surgeon's blade. What haunted me most was not her absence, but the fear that perhaps she saw me the way everyone else did, as lesser. Had I taught her, through my own quiet endurance, that it was acceptable to overlook me? Did my silence become her example? I tried to recall the last meaningful conversation we had, and all I could find were fragments. Warnings about college, arguments about friends, questions she barely answered. I wanted so much to believe she loved me still, but love without presence feels like an echo. It exists, but it cannot be touched. And in the echo of Claire's silence, I felt my heart fracture into pieces too small to gather. I lay in that hospital bed wondering if she would ever choose me again, if there would ever come a day when she would see me not as Amelia's sister or Daniel's wife, but simply as her mother. I imagined her future, career, marriage, children, and wondered if my role would always be that of the forgotten figure in the background of her photographs. The thought made my chest ache in a way no medication could soothe. For the first time, I allowed myself to whisper aloud into the empty room, "Claire, why wasn't I enough for you?" The words dissolved into the air, unanswered, leaving me with nothing but the silence that carried her name. Luke has always been different from Claire, quieter, softer in ways that reminded me of myself as a child. Where Claire demanded attention with her energy, Luke drifted gently through rooms, content to observe rather than command. He loved small things, sketching in notebooks, tinkering with broken toys, listening to music that only he seemed to understand. Sometimes, I worried that his silence would make him invisible, that he would inherit my shadow instead of Amelia's spotlight. But unlike me, Luke's silence wasn't weakness, it was depth, a reservoir of thoughts he rarely shared, but carried with weight. In him, I saw the possibility of a bond unbroken by Amelia's charm. Even so, Amelia had a way of slipping into his world as well. She praised his drawings, bought him sketchbooks, and told him stories about art exhibitions she had visited in cities he dreamed of seeing. He lit up at her attention, and I felt a pang of envy that I quickly smothered, reminding myself that he was just a boy, eager for encouragement from anyone who noticed. Still, it hurt. I wanted to be the one whose praise mattered most, the one whose voice shaped his confidence. Yet, even with Amelia's presence, Luke often came back to me in quiet ways, sitting beside me without words, slipping notes under my door with doodles, or asking me to proofread his school essays. Those small gestures were lifelines I clung to, proof that he had not drifted entirely away. I remember one evening vividly. Claire had been shouting about curfew, Daniel was pacing with frustration, and Amelia, visiting as usual, managed to soothe everyone with a laugh that made the tension dissolve. Luke slipped into the kitchen where I was washing dishes and whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. I like being here with you." The words were simple, but they steadied me in a way nothing else could. He had noticed my silence, my exclusion, and he had chosen to sit in it with me. That moment reminded me that even if I had lost Claire's loyalty, Luke's quiet heart still beat in rhythm with mine. but Luke was only 15, and 15 is an age caught between obedience and rebellion, love and resentment. I knew he struggled with the pull of two worlds, mine, quieter and often overlooked, and Amelia's, dazzling and full of promises. It wasn't fair to ask him to choose, yet every time he leaned toward her, I felt the sting of betrayal. I worried that my need for him might suffocate him, push him closer to the brightness he thought he wanted. I tried to give him freedom, tried not to ask too much, but the fear of losing him gnawed at me relentlessly. Every gesture of kindness he offered felt like a rope thrown to someone already slipping beneath the waves. When I thought about the party that had stolen my family from me tonight, I couldn't help wondering what Luke felt. Did he smile easily, or did his eyes dart toward the door, remembering where I was? Did he laugh with Claire, with Daniel, with Amelia, or did he sit quietly in the corner, torn by guilt? I imagined him holding a glass of soda, while others toasted champagne, his face conflicted in a way nobody noticed. Perhaps he wanted to be here. Perhaps his absence was not truly his choice. The possibility gave me a fragile thread of comfort, though I couldn't be sure if it was truth or just the story I told myself to survive. I held on to the belief that Luke would come, that at any moment the door might open, and his lanky frame would appear, carrying the awkward love only a teenage boy can offer. I longed for his presence, for his quiet defense of me, for his eyes that saw what others ignored. Yet the hours stretched on, and the room remained empty. My heart whispered that perhaps even Luke, my last fragile hope, had been swept fully into Amelia's orbit. The thought felt like betrayal, but worse, it felt like inevitability. And so I lay still, my hand clutching the sheets, praying that one day he would have the courage to choose me before it was too late. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but instead of rest, my mind conjured the images I dreaded most. I saw Amelia's house glowing with light, every window spilling laughter into the night. Guests arrived in elegant clothes, arms full of flowers and bottles of wine, their smiles eager to celebrate her achievement. I could almost hear the clink of glasses, the music pulsing faintly through the walls, the chorus of congratulations that followed her wherever she went. And among the guests I saw them, Daniel, Claire, and Luke, standing proudly at her side, as though they belonged there more than here. The picture burned itself into my imagination, and I couldn't push it away. Daniel would be the center of attention almost as much as Amelia, charming the relatives with his easy conversation and perfectly timed jokes. He had always been good at blending in, at winning over crowds, and I imagined how seamlessly he must have fit into her night. I pictured him leaning close to her as they laughed, his hand brushing her arm in a gesture casual enough to be excused, but intimate enough to linger. The thought made my chest tighten. While I lay stitched and sore, he was raising his glass in her honor, his loyalty poured into a toast that should have been saved for me. The cruelty of it was not in his absence, but in the ease of his presence with her. Claire, too, would shine in that room. She had inherited Amelia's charisma and knew how to stand among adults as though she were one of them. I imagined her listening intently to her aunt's speech, her eyes bright with admiration, her smile wide, as though she had found her future self reflected in Amelia. Perhaps she even whispered, "I want to be like you," words she never once said to me. I thought of how quickly she had slipped away from me, not with malice, but with hunger for the kind of success she believed Amelia embodied. Tonight, she wasn't just celebrating her aunt's promotion, she was rehearsing her own escape from me. And then there was Luke, my fragile hope. I pictured him sitting quietly at the edge of the crowd, a glass of soda sweating in his hand. Perhaps he laughed when others laughed, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. Perhaps he stared at the floor, wishing he were anywhere else. Or perhaps, my heart clenched, he was laughing genuinely, swept into the warmth of Amelia's glow. I wanted to believe he felt the weight of my absence, that he thought of me as the music played, but I couldn't be sure. The cruelty of imagination is that it gives no answers, only possibilities, and each one hurt more than the last. The sound of celebration I invented in my head grew louder, drowning out the silence of my room. I could almost hear the toast itself, glasses raised high, Amelia smiling modestly as she accepted their praise, Daniel's voice leading the cheer. "To Amelia," they would cry, their joy vibrating through the walls of a house where I was never truly welcome. And as the glasses touched, I imagined the faint echo of shattering glass inside me, a toast that broke something fragile in my chest. It was not jealousy that consumed me, but the realization that I had been forgotten entirely, that the people I had given everything to were now giving everything to her. When I opened my eyes again, the hospital room was darker, lonelier, its silence absolute. No music, no laughter, no clinking of glasses, only the faint hum of machines and the ache of stitches pulling with every breath. Yet the absence of sound did not comfort me, because in my heart, I still heard the party. I could feel its warmth, its light, its betrayal searing me as surely as fire sears flesh, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they would even remember to come tomorrow, or if Amelia's glow would continue to hold them captive. The toast had been made, and I was not in it. The memory hit me like a sudden gust of wind through a cracked window, chilling and impossible to ignore. Weeks before my surgery, I had been passing through the living room when I thought I heard voices behind the closed door of Amelia's study. I froze, pressing my ear against the wall, convinced at first that it was my imagination. But the voices grew clearer, hushed, yet urgent. Daniel's tone lower than I had ever heard, Amelia's laugh lighter than I remembered. I caught fragments, phrases that didn't belong to ordinary family conversation. Words like plan, waiting, and together floated through the thin walls, and my chest tightened in confusion. I had recoiled, telling myself I must have misheard, that it was nonsense. For days afterward, the memory lingered in corners of my mind, a gnawing itch I could not scratch. I watched Daniel closely, noticing the smallest gestures, how he occasionally smiled when checking his phone, or lingered too long in thought after returning from a walk. I convinced myself that paranoia was a dangerous friend, and I wanted to ignore it, bury it beneath the comforting narrative that he loved me, that he always had. But the doubt had lodged itself like a splinter, tiny, yet sharp, impossible to remove completely. Every time Amelia entered the room with her effortless charm, I felt the echo of that conversation, a whisper that perhaps some part of him was no longer mine. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, a moment taken out of context, but I could not erase the intensity of their voices in my memory. It was not just what was said, but the intimacy in the way they spoke, a rhythm I had never heard between husband and sister before. Even now, recalling it in the dim hospital room, the walls seemed to hum with that secret, as if they were listening to me remember. I wondered if I had been naive all these years, thinking I understood Daniel completely, that our love had roots strong enough to withstand any storm. Perhaps I had been blind, or worse, willingly blind, to the truth buried behind polite smiles and quiet reassurances. I could still see Amelia's expression, the curl of her lips, the mischievous light in her eyes that I had dismissed as playful confidence. Daniel's voice had been lower than usual, almost conspiratorial, like a private world they shared that excluded me entirely. The thought that they could have been planning something, anything, without my knowledge, churned a storm of anger and betrayal in my chest. My hands clenched the hospital sheets, nails digging into the fabric as I fought against the rising panic. How many small secrets had slipped past me unnoticed, small enough to seem trivial, yet together forming a lattice of deceit I had only now begun to see. In that moment, the hospital room felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were pressing in to remind me of all I had ignored. Every absence, every diverted gaze, every unspoken smile replayed itself in my mind with cruel precision. The laughter and clinking of glasses at Amelia's party, Daniel and Claire's absence, Luke's uncertain loyalty, all of it became connected in a web I could no longer deny. The memory of their whispered conversation, once brushed off as meaningless, now took on a weight I could not escape. I had been living in ignorance, comforting myself with illusions, and tonight those illusions had been stripped away, leaving only raw truth. I realized then that the past and present were colliding, that every choice made by those I loved carried consequences I had ignored. The betrayal I had always feared was not theoretical. It was real, seeping into every interaction I had observed, every absence I had endured. And now, with my body weak and my spirit fragile, the full scope of it pressed down on me like a stone. I could no longer pretend I didn't notice, could no longer pretend I didn't remember. The walls, once silent witnesses, now seemed to echo with their secret, and the truth I had resisted for so long burned through me with relentless clarity. My mother's voice has always lingered in the corners of my memory, sharp and soft at once, like wind through brittle leaves. She never meant to wound me, she always said, yet her words carried a weight I could never lift. Amelia is destined for greatness, she would tell anyone who would listen, her eyes lighting up as though she were speaking of a queen. When she looked at me, it was with a careful, measured gaze, as if she were checking whether I was enough without ever declaring it aloud. I learned early that her love was conditional, calibrated according to achievement and applause, and that I existed in her eyes only when I mirrored Amelia's brilliance. Every word of praise for my sister became a quiet verdict on my worth. I remember countless evenings sitting at the edge of the dining table, watching my mother straighten Amelia's dress or smooth her hair before school events. I sat silently, my homework forgotten, trying to shrink into the chair so I would not disturb the perfection she adored. I longed for her attention, for a glance or a nod that said, "You are enough too." But instead, her voice would float past me, warm and tender for Amelia, and I would curl my hands in my lap, hiding the ache in my chest. By the time I understood the power of her favoritism, it had become second nature. I measured my worth by her eyes, by the space I could occupy without upsetting the brilliance of my sister. Even as an adult, Margaret's voice has haunted me, softer now, but no less commanding. Her compliments, though rarer, still carry the weight of judgment. When I shared my achievements with her, she would smile faintly, a shadow of the radiant pride reserved for Amelia. "You've done well," she might say, but always followed by a story of Amelia's triumphs. I tried to forgive her, telling myself that love is imperfect, that she did the best she could. Yet tonight, alone in a hospital room while my family celebrated my sister, I realized that her favoritism had never been about love. It had been about hierarchy, about who deserved the center of attention. Margaret always believed she was encouraging us both, but encouragement cannot exist where comparison dominates. She shaped my life by teaching me to disappear, to endure, to survive without expectation. I had followed her rules for years, believing endurance was a form of strength, that sacrifice equaled love, and yet each sacrifice seemed only to reinforce my invisibility. I had become expert at shrinking myself, at folding my desires into neat, unnoticeable shapes. Now, lying here, I recognized the cost, a lifetime of second-place victories, of muted celebrations, of love that felt earned only when measured against someone else. Her voice echoes tonight, not from the room, but from the past, taunting and tender all at once. I hear it in Daniel's absence, in Claire's drifting gaze, in Luke's hesitant loyalty. I hear it in Amelia's laughter, in every toast made without me, in every glance that passes me by. I see it in the walls of this sterile hospital room, where silence screams louder than applause. Margaret's favoritism was not an act of cruelty. It was a legacy, a lens through which my family continues to view me. And tonight that lens has focused sharply, showing me the reality I can no longer deny. I have been overlooked, undervalued, unseen, my voice drowned by the one that always mattered more. Yet even as I confront this truth, I feel a small ember of defiance flicker within me. Margaret's voice may have shaped the past, but it cannot dictate my future. I am 31, stitched and weary, yet still capable of thought, feeling, and choice. I realize that the love I seek from them, Daniel, Claire, Luke, may not come on their terms, and perhaps, just perhaps, the recognition I crave must begin with me, in the quiet of this hospital room, acknowledging my own worth when no one else does. That realization is painful, yet necessary, a seed of strength buried in the soil of betrayal. The hours in the hospital passed like a slow tide, pulling at my memories and dredging up emotions I had long tried to suppress. The pain in my body was real, sharp, and unrelenting, yet it was nothing compared to the ache of realization settling into my chest. I had spent 31 years navigating the shadows of others, bending myself to fit their expectations, hoping that in doing so I might be seen, loved, and chosen. But the truth I could no longer deny was that I had been invisible, not because of a lack of effort, but because they chose to see someone else. That knowledge stung, yet strangely, it was freeing. For the first time in years, I could stop pretending that I belonged in the background. Dr. Harris visited again in the afternoon, his presence steady and grounding, and I found myself speaking with him about things I had never voiced aloud. He listened without interruption, without judgment, allowing my words to spill over like a river I had dammed too long. In recounting my feelings of abandonment, my lifelong invisibility, and the sting of watching my family celebrate Amelia, I felt a release I had not known was possible. His responses were simple, but profound. "You have survived every absence, every slight, every shadow. That endurance has value, Evelyn. You are not defined by the choices of others, but by your own strength." Those words became a mantra, repeating in my mind even as visitors passed by my door, unaware of the emotional battle waging inside me. I began to see my life differently, recognizing that my resilience was not weakness, but power. For years, I had allowed others' favoritism and choices to dictate my sense of self-worth. Now, I realized that the same endurance that had made me invisible had also preserved me, giving me a clarity few ever acquire. Amelia could bask in the spotlight, Daniel could smile where he chose, Claire could drift, and Luke could hesitate, but none of it could erase my existence or my strength. I thought about the years of silences, of parties I was never invited to, of milestones observed from the margins. They had shaped me, yes, but they had not broken me. And if anything, the fractures had allowed me to see the world in ways others could not. Nuances, subtleties, hidden emotions that often escaped even the brightest eyes. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my value did not require their acknowledgement, that my worth was intrinsic, not borrowed from applause or approval. The hospital room, once a prison of solitude, became instead a chamber of awakening, a place where I could reclaim the center of my own story. I began to envision a future in which I no longer waited for recognition that might never come. I could seek connections that nourished rather than drained, offer love without expectation of reciprocation, and carve a life that honored my own desires. The thought was terrifying in its unfamiliarity, yet exhilarating. I had been a footnote for too long. Perhaps now it was time to write the first lines of my own narrative, one that did not depend on Amelia's success, Daniel's choices, or my children's shifting loyalties. For the first time, I felt the fragile flicker of agency, a glimmer that my story was still mine to shape. That night, as the lights dimmed and the quiet of the hospital settled over me, I closed my eyes with a new understanding. Shadows would always exist. They were part of life, part of family, part of the world, but they no longer needed to define me. I could feel the tension in my chest ease slightly, replaced by the subtle, resilient warmth of self-recognition. My body ached, yes, but my spirit had begun to lift. And as I drifted toward an uneasy sleep, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I could be seen, fully and without apology, even if those who had overlooked me continued to choose otherwise. Even from my hospital bed, I could feel Amelia's presence in the world outside, subtle, yet omnipresent, like a shadow stretching over every room she entered. Her victories were never quiet. They demanded attention, admiration, and validation, and she always ensured the spotlight followed her wherever she went. I had lived in the glow of that light my whole life, either basking briefly when allowed, or shrinking into the darkness when denied. Now, lying here, I understood that what I had once called chance, jealousy, or misfortune was often Amelia's deliberate orchestration, a careful maneuvering that left me perpetually a step behind. The thought both infuriated and terrified me. How many years had she controlled my life without my noticing? Daniel's role in her game haunted me most. I recalled the hushed conversations, the glances that lingered too long, the subtle changes in his behavior around Amelia. At first, I had chalked it up to friendship or politeness, but now I saw the pattern. His loyalty was fractured, not entirely gone, but weakened by her persistent gravitational pull. He smiled at her the way he once smiled at me, a warmth I had trusted, and it tore through me to recognize the truth. Love could be present yet divided, and my husband's heart, though strong, was not immune to her sway. I felt a bitter twist in my chest, a recognition that some part of him had always been reserved for Amelia, carefully hidden behind polite words and routine affection. I remembered the subtle ways she undermined me, always gentle enough to deny confrontation. A misplaced comment, a suggestive look, a question that planted doubt. Amelia never attacked directly, but she seeded insecurity and waited for it to grow. Every party she threw, every achievement she celebrated, every interaction she orchestrated with my children, carried a layer of manipulation I had failed to see until now. The realization was suffocating. I had thought my invisibility was circumstantial, a product of circumstance, but it had been intentional, a careful design that left me second in every arena. I felt the sting of betrayal ripple through me, a cold flame igniting in my veins. Yet even in the face of this revelation, I discovered a strange clarity. Understanding the game, recognizing its rules, gave me a kind of power I had never had. If Amelia's influence had been subtle but deliberate, perhaps I could respond in ways she could not anticipate. Perhaps my strength, my resilience, and my patience could counter the shadow she had cast over me. The thought sparked a flicker of defiance, a glimmer of the woman I had long suppressed beneath years of endurance and comparison. It was terrifying, but it was mine. I had been living reactively, and now I had the possibility of living with intention. I imagined confronting her, not with rage, but with quiet certainty, a presence she could not manipulate. I would not demand apologies or recognition, for I had learned that such things were seldom granted freely. Instead, I would reclaim my story in ways small and deliberate, choices that demonstrated my worth without needing her approval. I could love my children, care for myself, and embrace Daniel's loyalty where it truly resided, untangling the strands of my life from her gravitational pull. Amelia could shine all she wanted, but I would no longer orbit in her shadow. I would be visible on my own terms, even if the world insisted otherwise. As night settled over the hospital, I felt an unexpected sense of calm. The anger remained, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something stronger, resolve. I could no longer change the past, no longer undo the years spent under her influence, but I could shape the present and the future. Amelia's game had been cruel, deliberate, and suffocating, but I could step out of it, carve my own path, and define my worth on my own terms. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that survival was not enough, that I could not only endure, but rise. And with that thought, I drifted into a restless, determined sleep, ready to reclaim what had been denied for far too long. The soft beep of the hospital monitor was interrupted by the tentative knock on my door. a sound I had grown used to ignoring. But this time, hesitation gave way to curiosity, and I called out, "Come in." The door creaked, and a familiar figure stepped into the room, his presence both shocking and grounding. It was Thomas, my college friend, the one who had always seen me in full, without comparison or judgment. I had not expected to see him here, not after years of lost contact. Yet there he stood, smiling awkwardly, holding a bouquet of wildflowers I remembered he used to pick from the park for me. My heart thumped in a way it hadn't for years, and a rush of memories collided with the sterile smell of antiseptic. Thomas had always been different from anyone else in my life. Where my family measured and compared, he simply observed, accepted, and celebrated me for who I was. We had shared long nights in college talking about dreams, fears, and absurd what-ifs, never feeling the need to compete or prove anything. When I saw him now, older, yet familiar, I realized how much I had missed that kind of presence, someone who recognized my value without scrutiny, without expectation. The room felt warmer, as if his very existence had pushed back the shadows that clung so tightly to me. I felt a surge of gratitude, relief, and an unexpected hope. He pulled a chair close to my bed, careful not to disturb the monitors, and began speaking in that calm, measured tone I had loved in our younger days. "Evelyn," he said, his eyes searching mine, "I heard about what happened. I know it's been hard, and I wanted to be here. You've always been stronger than anyone realized." There was no embellishment, no pity, just acknowledgement. It hit me with a force I hadn't expected. I had spent decades seeking validation from the wrong people, chasing echoes that would never fully satisfy me. Here was someone who saw me clearly, and it was intoxicating, terrifying, and comforting all at once. As we talked, the walls of the hospital seemed to fade, replaced by memories of afternoons in coffee shops, late-night walks through city streets, and the shared laughter that had once felt infinite. I realized how starved I had been for authenticity, how deeply I had craved someone to witness my life without comparison or hidden agendas. Thomas did not need to compete with Amelia, did not need my children to approve, did not need Daniel's presence to validate his concern. His focus was entirely on me, and the weight of that simple attention was overwhelming. For the first time in years, I felt unburdened, unjudged, and entirely seen. I hesitated, feeling the fragile hope that his visit sparked, worried that it might be fleeting or unreal. Could someone like him truly belong in my life again? Or had I imagined him as a safe harbor that no longer existed? Thomas seemed to read my thoughts, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know life has been unfair, but I've always believed in you, Evelyn, and I still do." His words were a lifeline, pulling me from the isolation I had endured, offering a path forward I had thought closed. It was a startling, almost shocking realization that support and love could exist outside the family I had long depended on. As he prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, I felt a strange mixture of gratitude and courage. His visit had shifted something inside me, planting a seed of possibility. Perhaps I did not need Amelia's applause, Daniel's divided loyalty, Claire's drifting, or even Luke's hesitation to define my life. Perhaps I could claim my worth on my own terms, and find relationships that honored me fully, without comparison or shadow. That night, I lay in the hospital bed, the emptiness of the room tempered by the warmth of a friendship renewed. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that I could step out of the shadows and into the light I had long been denied. The call came late in the afternoon, a voice I barely recognized over the line, trembling yet urgent. It was a nurse from the hospital, asking if I could come to the administration office immediately. Something in the tone, tight and trembling, set my heart racing with both fear and curiosity. I shuffled down the sterile hallway, each step heavy with anticipation, trying to suppress the panic that clawed at my chest. When I entered the small office, the nurse motioned for me to sit, and the air felt dense, thick, with unspoken truths. My pulse pounded, my mind whirling, as if the walls themselves were bracing me for impact. She handed me a sealed envelope, the kind that only carried legal or official documents. "This was found in Mr. Daniel's personal effects," she said quietly, her eyes avoiding mine. My hands shook as I broke the seal, unfolding the papers inside. Letters, receipts, and photographs spilled across the desk, each one more incriminating than the last. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. Undeniable proof that Daniel and Amelia had been planning something far more deliberate than mere favoritism or divided attention. They had been plotting behind my back, coordinating actions that affected not only me but my children as well. The betrayal cut deeper than I had ever imagined possible. The letters detailed meetings, gifts, and conversations, all carefully orchestrated to isolate me from my family. Amelia's influence over Claire and Luke was deliberate, calculated, and sustained over months. Daniel had played his part, providing small justifications, quiet excuses, and feigned concern to maintain my trust while undermining it in subtle ways. The documentation left no room for doubt. Every absence, every overlooked request, every moment of favoritism was not accidental. It was part of a carefully executed plan. I felt the room tilt around me, as if gravity itself had shifted to emphasize the depth of their deception. Anger surged through me, a boiling, raw fire that demanded acknowledgement. I had spent years questioning myself, wondering if I had failed, if my presence had been insufficient, and yet, the truth was theirs to bear, not mine. They had chosen manipulation, secrecy, and cruelty while I endured, healed, and loved blindly. My fists clenched the edge of the desk, the paper crumpling beneath my fingers. I felt a strange exhilaration in knowing I had been right all along, even as the knowledge burned through me with the intensity of betrayal. Every whispered doubt, every missed visit, every hollow smile now made sense. Yet amidst the shock, another emotion quietly emerged: liberation. The revelation freed me from the false guilt I had carried for decades. I had not failed. They had deceived. The weight of self-blame, nurtured for so long by Amelia's brilliance and my mother's favoritism, lifted slightly, replaced by the clarity of truth. I realized that the path forward was no longer about seeking validation or understanding from those who had betrayed me. It was about reclaiming my life, my children, and my dignity on my own terms, without the shadows of deceit shaping my every step. By the time I left the administration office, clutching the papers tightly, I felt a mix of fury, grief, and unexpected resolve. The hospital corridors seemed less confining, the machines less oppressive, as if the truth had given me space to breathe. Amelia's game had been exposed, Daniel's duplicity laid bare, and the narrative I had been forced to inhabit for decades shattered into pieces I no longer needed to assemble for anyone's approval. I returned to my room, determined to confront what remained of my life with clarity and courage. For the first time, I realized that I could step fully into my own story, unafraid, unashamed, and unbound. The morning sun slanted through the hospital window, cutting across the pale sheets like a promise I had almost forgotten. I felt a strength in my bones that had nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with the healing of flesh, but with the reclamation of my spirit. For the first time in years, I understood that my worth was not tethered to Amelia's applause, Daniel's divided loyalty, or my children's choices. I had endured, survived, and now I could rise. The air in the room felt different, lighter, as if the truth I had uncovered had cleared the shadows away. I breathed deeply, allowing the warmth to fill the hollow spaces that betrayal had once carved. Daniel arrived later, hesitant and pale, carrying the weight of the revelation like a physical burden. I met his gaze without flinching, seeing for the first time the man who had been both my partner and my deceiver. His voice faltered as he began to explain, to justify, but I held up a hand, stopping the excuses before they could take root. "I know everything," I said calmly, the tremor of anger beneath my words giving them gravity. "The letters, the planning, the choices you made. I have lived long enough in the shadow of your decisions. I will no longer ask for understanding or forgiveness. I will act on my own." His eyes widened, as if realizing for the first time that I had grown beyond the person he thought he could manipulate. Claire and Luke arrived later, their expressions a mixture of guilt and hesitation. I saw the flicker of understanding in their eyes, the recognition that I had known all along, and that their absence, their divided loyalties, had mattered more to me than they realized. I did not scold them. I did not demand apologies. Instead, I offered honesty, the simplest yet most revolutionary form of connection. "I love you both," I told them, "but you have the right to make your choices. I cannot live in your decisions any longer. You may return to me willingly, or you may not, but I will stand in my own light regardless." Their faces softened, the weight of years of misaligned expectations pressing down on them now shared in silence. Amelia did not arrive that day, and I did not expect her to. I had once hung on her presence like a lifeline, but now I felt a fierce independence, a clarity that freed me from the orbit of her influence. I imagined her world, still dazzling, still meticulously orchestrated, yet I no longer needed to occupy its margins. My story was mine alone, shaped not by her brilliance, not by my mother's favoritism, not by Daniel's choices, but by my endurance, my courage, and my capacity to see truth without fear. I felt a quiet triumph, a reclamation of the space that had always been mine, yet denied to me for decades. Thomas returned in the evening, bringing with him a sense of normalcy and unconditional presence I had not realized I craved so deeply. His smile, gentle and unassuming, was a balm to the wounds that Amelia's games had inflicted. We talked, laughed, and allowed the years of distance to fall away, leaving only authenticity. In his presence, I recognized the value of relationships built on honesty and care, not manipulation or comparison. My heart, once brittle and cautious, expanded with gratitude, and the soft warmth of trust rebuilt. I realized that while some family ties might remain fractured, I could create new bonds that honored my existence without compromise. As night fell, the hospital quieted, and I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth. For the first time, I felt fully visible, fully alive and unafraid. The shadows of favoritism, betrayal, and absence had shaped me, yes, but they could not define me. I was Evelyn, 31, scarred but resilient, overlooked yet unbowed. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my story, and in the stillness of that night, I whispered to the universe and to myself, a vow both quiet and infinite. I am here, I have survived, and I will shine on my own terms. The light I had longed for all my life was finally mine.